Hello and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project. And thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I have the most interesting guest with me today, and he's got a lot of positive energy. I think you're going to absolutely love this episode. His name is Ray Martin. He is also known as the Daily Explorer, and he is an entrepreneur, an award-winning business leader. As a coach, mentor, facilitator, speaker, writer, and mindfulness teacher, he is a torchbearer for human consciousness. Ray is also a marathon runner and fundraiser who is on a mission to empower people to live authentically and to bring more joy and happiness into the world. Oh my gosh, I love this so much, I can't stand it. He is the author of the book titled Life Without a Tie, which chronicles his 14-year-long backpacking journey, which changed his life forever. Ray, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much. That's a lovely intro, by the way. Thank
Oh,
you.
well, you have a lovely story. Not all of it is lovely, and we will be getting into that, but way to make lemons or make lemonade out of lemons.
Mm,
I love the fact bringing more joy and happiness into the world. I just want to highlight that, in red letters, because that is so needed, I think, right
mm.
about now.
I agree. We're living in turbulent times, aren't we? I mean, there's so much going on in the world
I
where people are
know.
suffering unnecessarily. And I know I can't really do much about it on a global level, but I feel I can really do the best I can do is to just be a transmitter of care and love and joy to those around me. So I'm definitely committed to that.
And one person at a time. That's all
One
it takes,
person at a
just
time.
one
Yeah.
person. And then that just kind of just grows and grows and grows
Yeah.
into more and more people. So it is my goal to just through the podcast try and make the world a better place. And with the guests that I've got on, such as yourself, I
Yeah.
honestly believe that that is going to happen.
Great, great. Thumbs up.
Okay,
Me.
so you have the most amazing story. And you actually, I think it was 2005, where, your life was crashing down around you,
Mm,
and you decided to take a sabbatical, a 6-month long sabbatical
that's right.
that turned into 14 years.
Yes, totally.
Okay,
Never
so
would have imagined it, to be honest. It was
so
really
tell us what
unexpected.
happened.
The short version of the story is that I have been living, a life in London. I started a company and it was very successful, and I've been doing it for about 10 years. And my business partner was the woman I was married to.
Mm.
Um, Yet there must have been something about that life that I don't know didn't rest well with me, because one day my wife came back from a meeting and said, "I'm very suddenly I'm out of the marriage and I'm out of the company. I'm leaving." And it was a massive shock. And I realized in that moment, gosh, I didn't see this coming. Something's happened to my awareness and attention and understanding. So it was a huge shock for me. And unfortunately, at the same time, my father got very ill and he passed away. So within 3 or 4 months, I was standing in a bomb crater that used to be my life. And there was, no marriage. I was out of my home. My business had gone and my dad had gone. And it
Wow.
just left me in a state of real shock. And I was really broken, to be honest. And I spent about a year just in that kind of broken paralysis. And
Mm.
friends of mine who were brilliant, they rallied around, and a lot of them encouraged me to take a break and go on a sabbatical just to reflect deeply on what had happened and try and find some sense of meaning from it and a sense of a future direction beyond the immediate aftermath of what was happening. And I thought that was a great piece of advice. And so it
Mm.
sort of slowly materialized. I decided to do this sabbatical. And I thought I'll sell my house in London, which was way too big for my life without my wife in it. And when I come back after 6 months, I'll get another property and I'll start another business. And that was the plan.
Mhm.
So I kind of arranged all of that, went off. And then a series of random unforeseen events started to unfold. And I thought, after 6 months, I thought, I'm not ready to go back yet. I'm going to stay a few more months until I bottom this out. And then a little bit longer. And in the end, it was 14 years before I finally made it back to England in 2019. And that
You know,
and that was mainly because my inner wisdom guides were saying to me, I'd started writing a book about the journey. My guides were saying, you must go back to England and finish writing the book. You must
Mhm.
do that. And so I followed that wisdom.
As you're telling this story, all I could think of, because you had everything planned out, you had your entire life planned
Mm,
out, and then when it all
that's
fell
right.
apart, then you had your sabbatical, your backpacking journey all planned out, and boy, did
Yeah.
that change. And all I could think of is that phrase, you know, man plans, God laughs.
Yes. Yes.
And I
Yeah.
do believe he was having a very good time at your expense.
He really was. And what it asked of me, what it invited me to consider was dumping an existing navigation system, which is all based on sort of pushing into goals and setting targets and goals and achievements, and instead moving to a much more intuitive system, which Michael Singer, in his book, The Untethered Soul and the Surrender Experiment, he talks about it. He calls it living in surrender. And it's that idea of saying, rather than you determining with your mind what's next for you, just watch and feel into life and feel what's being invited of you and respond accordingly and take what's coming and
So,
accept the reality in front of you. This is an interesting experiment for a while.
so was that difficult for you? Because it seems like that your life before was very structured
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
well
very.
planned out and very goal oriented, and then to go from that kind of a mindset to completely flip it around to just live a life of surrender and acceptance.
Yeah.
What was
Yeah.
that like to transition with that mindset?
Well, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked because I was classically trained. I worked in sales. We were heavily
Mhm.
targeted every year. We had to come up with plans and forecasts
Mhm.
and make things happen. And so
Mhm.
that for 15, 20 years, that was how my mind worked. And when I became CEO of the company I launched, um, there were salaries to pay and people to take care of. And so you couldn't do that on a wing and a prayer. You had to have plans and goals and targets.
Mhm.
And I think that's appropriate. I think that's okay. Yeah, nothing wrong with that.
Mhm.
Um, but when I had a chance to try an alternative after sort of 25 years of living by that system, I was kind of in shock because I never knew what it was like to wake up in the morning and not have a goal or a target. I mean, it really was a shock psychologically. And I found a lot of solace and useful advice in a book called Transitions by William Bridges,
Mhm.
because he's one of the world's experts. He was when he was alive on transitions. And he explains in his book that there are actually three phases to a transition. There's the ending of the life you know,
Mhm.
there's the beginning of a new life, but
Mhm.
there's this phase in the middle which no one really understands or navigates clearly. And he calls it the neutral zone between the
Mhm.
ending and the beginning. He said, and he explains that that could last a few days, a few weeks, a few months, even a couple of years in some instances. And
Mhm.
in that, he's got a very clear set of guidelines for how to live through the neutral zone, which involves not making any big decisions, setting up temporary structures, taking care of yourself in little ways that you wouldn't otherwise, and a whole bunch of other. I put some of these in the book that I wrote so that people can see them, but
Mhm.
um, it just really illuminated me to see that there was nothing wrong with me being completely unknowing how to decide or feeling uncertain and all of those things.
Mhm.
The way he described that neutral zone, it was exactly fitting to that. And I went,
Mhm.
oh my God, I'm in a neutral zone. I didn't know until then.
So at some level, was it disconcerting? Because it seems like a
Yeah.
lot of your identity, and your self image was wrapped up in that CEO type of position and that lifestyle. And now
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
like, if I dare say, living the life of, the hippie.
I definitely, and I felt a sense of. Sometimes I felt guilt, shame. I thought I'm not pulling my weight in society. I'm not doing a
Mhm.
job. I'm not earning tax revenues for the government. I'm not
Mhm.
doing any of these things that I did for every year of my life. And so
Mhm.
I did have a bit of sort of guilt and shame around it. And then
Isn't
I
that
kind of,
funny
it is,
that the
it is.
guilt and the shame? And, with everything that you had contributed to society up until that
Yeah,
point, at the sacrifice of your own, I don't want to say happiness, because I'm sure you were happy in your job and
yeah,
everything else, but a sacrificing of your own life, to feel guilt and shame by taking charge of your life again. That sounds
yeah.
like so twisted, but I understand it.
I think I'm glad that I did feel those things because this was a great unraveling period for me. This was a period of unraveling a lot of beliefs I'd gathered since I was very young about how life, what the rules of life are. And of course, the rules of life are unofficial. They're not documented anywhere.
Mhm.
Everyone's got their own rules that they've
Mhm.
inherited. But another book that really helped me and really helped me accept a new way of living was a book by Bronnie Ware called The Top Five Regrets of the Dying. It's very famous, the book. Lots of people refer to it. And
Mhm.
she'd made the observation, because she works in a hospice where people go to die,
Mhm.
she'd spoken to over 1,000 people in the hospice over a period of time and said, asked them all, what do you most regret about your life? And she said, they always said the same five things, no matter what they did, no matter how rich or poor they were or what successes they'd had. There's always the same five things. And the number one thing was, I wished I'd lived my life true to myself and not the
Oh.
life that others expected of me.
Mhm.
And that, God, when I read that, it just like, it punched me between the eyes. It was like such a big impact. I sat motionless for a few hours. I thought, if I applied that to myself, what would living life true to myself look like in the future? I have no idea. I literally had no idea what that life would mean. And so I needed to go on some kind of journey to start an exploration and start discovering what were the components of that, what did it need to look like and feel like. And I was, it was kind of, I was exploring to discover it for myself for quite a
Mhm.
while.
So when you started that journey, that backpacking journey,
Mm.
did you have any preconceived either notions or expectations of what you were going to get out of it? And did you feel once you started it, did you feel a little discombobulated, like, a little like
Yeah, totally.
lost?
Yeah, totally. Plus, I was in Asia. I'd never been to Asia in my life. I
Oh,
mean,
I
so I
did
was
not
in
know that.
countries where there was different language and different rules of cultural rules and everything. So it was a massive reorientation. Yeah, I didn't have a job to do, but I did have some needs that I needed to meet. Like, for example, I have a big value around connection and being a contributor in my
Mhm.
community. So even though I was traveling, I wanted to stay connected with all my friends and family at home. So I decided to write a blog because I thought that's how I can be connected and I can be of service to the community by sharing what I'm learning as it's happening in real time and sharing it. I knew nothing about technical things or blogging or anything like that. I had to teach myself like crash course. And once I kind of got on top of that, I started writing a blog. And over the first 4 or 5 years, sort of 10, 20,000 people a month were coming to read the blog. So
Mhm.
I knew I was doing something valuable. So those sorts of things made me feel like I had a purpose of sorts and I had some structure, but not much, but some enough to keep me from going completely freaking out. So
Mhm. That's so funny that you mentioned that about the blog because I
yeah,
had a woman who was, and I'm using air quotes here, who
yeah,
was helping me with
yeah,
marketing because she knew marketing, but not really. It was just something she was dabbling in. So she
yeah.
had actually set up a website for me, which, was pretty amateurish, but that's fine. And then I was actually back home. Both my parents were sick at the same time. And I got an email from her that said, oh, guess what? I came up with another marketing idea for you. I set up a blog for you. So I'm
Wow.
reading this email and I looked at my youngest sister, who's 13 years younger than me and into marketing. And I looked at her and I said, Alyssa, what's a blog? And why would I want one? And so she says, well, I think it's a good idea. Now's not the time just because you got a lot going on. Tell her to just, remove it, make it inactive. And then once you have a chance to think about it, then she can make it active again. You can start blogging. And I said, okay. So I sent her that email and asked her to do that. I got an immediate response and she said, LOL, the nice thing about having a blog is you don't have to do anything. I have 3 of them and I never do anything with them. And my
Oh wow.
sister was reading this over my shoulder and she says, I'm sure she's a really nice lady, but
Yeah,
she's an
brilliant.
idiot. Having a blog and doing nothing is even more harmful. So I had to teach myself
Yeah.
because
So
there was nobody
you
to
know
show
what
me.
it's like. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
And,
Absolutely.
and when I think back to that period, because it was all new to me, it made sense that blogs were on the rise because even Facebook didn't exist at that point. So there
Right.
was no way of sharing your life with your friends and community that there are now, like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Those things were just non existent. So
Mm-hmm.
the blog became the first step in an
Mm-hmm.
evolution
Mm-hmm.
where you could write stuff that that people at your level would read, because the only other thing was the online newspapers, and you couldn't
Mhm.
put your story in those. So,
Mhm. So
so
then
it
I
was.
have another question for you. Did those blog posts actually create a base or a foundation for the book?
They did in some ways, because I never knew this at the time I started it, but when I came to actually write the book, which was,
Mhm.
I didn't come up with the idea for the book until about 2011, and I left in 2005. By then, I'd written many, many, many episodes of the blog.
Mhm.
But what was great about that was I'd unwittingly recorded a diary, a chronological diary of all these places and events and times and dates. So I had a record that I could then go back to help me construct the story in the book.
Mhm.
Without that record, I would have struggled to remember half of the things I'd actually experienced. So
Mhm.
it was brilliant from that perspective. But the main reason for doing the blog was for family and friends, and it was, I wrote it in the third person as a sort of tongue in cheek, almost comedic blog
Mhm.
of someone called Mozzie Bite was writing the blog, and he was the editor, and he was interviewing Ray occasionally on his travels to find out where he was and what he was up to and what he was learning and how his life was changing.
Oh,
So
that's hilarious.
I was commenting in the blog, and people really seemed to like that style because it had a lot of
Mhm.
humor in it, a
Do you
lot of
still,
tongue
is
in
the
cheek.
blog still up?
It's still up, yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, there'll be links to it, or I can certainly give them to you. So
I would love you to send me the link
yeah,
to
I
the
will,
blog.
I
So
will.
I'd love to read them, and I would like to
Yeah,
put them in the show notes. And
okay,
especially because I think that I'm not somebody who can journal. I've never
yes,
kept a diary,
yeah,
but doing the blogs, and that's how I basically got my foundation or my start in both of my books. It was like, man, I've got all of these blog posts that are addressing what I want to talk about in a book. So boom, I've already got a good start. But it's really interesting just to follow along and look back at my early posts, which was 2010 or 11. And it
right.
was like, wow, I have come a long way, just not only in my personal journey, but in my writing skills.
Yeah, brilliant. Brilliant. It is. It's nice. It's nice to look back.
And so then my other question was, as you're telling, your family was reading it and your friends were reading it,
Mm.
did anybody think you were out of your mind taking this backpacking trip to begin with?
Maybe one or two, but in the main, people, especially my family and friends, were very supportive.
Hmm.
And they, because they knew what happened,
Yeah.
and they knew I was looking for new insight, because I
Hmm.
was about 45 years old when I left England. And I was at a time of life, which is classically known as the midway point.
Yeah.
And love, fortunately for me, Cheryl, I was okay for money. I'd had a business that's be successful for 10 years, so I wasn't, I was able to take a period of time off without having to think, how do I pay for food and stuff.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I had this breathing space that I could, and I really wanted to make the most of it. And my friends were very supportive about it. Yeah,
Hmm. So when you first started out and your intentions were to be gone for 6 months,
yeah.
when did you realize it might take longer?
I realized that when I went into my first, I don't know if your listeners will know what this is, but Vipassana retreat. It's the name the Buddhists give to a 10-day silent meditation retreat in a monastery. Because I had been feeling after 6 months, I was in a different environment, and on the surface everything went fine, but I felt a lot of fear about the future, a lot of agitation, a
Hmm.
lot of guilt and shame about not being part of the old system. And all of that just made me have very little inner peace. And I was telling one traveler I met this story, and he said, "Have you ever thought about doing a Vipassana retreat?" And I said, "I have no idea what that is." And when he explained it to me and described it, he said, "You go into a monastery for 10 days, you sit in silence, you meditate, the monks help you understand how the mind works, and you reflect on that." I just knew when I was listening, I just knew that was the right thing to do. I just knew it. I'd never been silent for more than 10 minutes. So I wondered how I'd cope with it. But I just knew my inner wisdom told me to do that. That's the thing to do. And when I came out of there, it was like someone, if the noise on in my head had a volume knob on the outside of my head that I could turn, I'd gone in with it at 10 out of 10 noise. And when I came out, it was like down to like 1 or 2 out of 10. Someone had turned it down, and there was much less noise. And I was much calmer, much more grounded. And everything looked different when I came out of the monastery. And I thought, it was such a profound shift in such a short space of time. I thought, I am not ready to go back into that chaotic, frenzied world I came out of yet. I've got some more exploration to do. So that's when I knew it wasn't enough.
Did you ever get, well, at the very beginning of that,
Yeah.
the 10 days, did you ever feel like, I just want to start talking, or I want to, I don't want to do this anymore, or, I'm bored, I need to, because that's how I would react.
There was a slight temptation of that, but I'm the kind of personality that once I've decided to commit to
Mm-hmm.
an experience, I'm kind of a purist. And so like
I
and
get it.
so it was almost the opposite because I had a girlfriend who was traveling with me at the time called Annie. And I wrote this in that this story is actually in the book, so people will read this if they pick it up. And she wanted to do the Vipassana retreat too. And I said, well, let's talk about this because if we both do the Vipassana retreat together at the same time, we might pass each other in on the way to the hall. And because they segregate men and women in the dormitories and it's all
Mm-hmm.
separate. So you can't mess around like that. But I said, if we pass each other, I don't want to speak to you or wave at you or anything because I would like to experience this opportunity as if I was doing it on my own. I'm okay with you being there, but if you give permission, I'd like to act as if we're completely not knowing each other so that we
Mm-hmm.
can stay within our own inner experience and not break that.
Mm-hmm.
I said, and if you're not comfortable with that, you do this one and I'll do the next one.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, no, I'm comfortable with that. So we made that pact before we went in. And as we entered the gates of the monastery, we sort of had a hug and a kiss. And I said, see you in 10 days, knowing full well I would see her every day,
Mm-hmm.
but that we wouldn't have the same relationship. So it was in suspension, really.
Mm-hmm.
And that was great. And I was very happy she was on the same wavelength as me.
Mm-hmm. That was brilliant because I can
Yeah.
see that that would be an incredible distraction.
Yeah, yeah, it would. And then I did see some solo travelers because there's about 120 people every month came to this monastery to do
Wow.
this meditation. It was always full. You had to get there at least a day before to register. It was so popular and so full. But a lot of them solo travelers, you could hear
Mm-hmm.
them talking in the evenings, or, and whispering and connecting. And the next morning you'd see an empty cushion where one guy and an empty cushion where one girl they'd met and they'd gone off and they decided to leave. And you could see this happening. So I thought, wow, there didn't take much to get them out of this because about of the 120 people that start, typically about 50 or 60 end up at the end, and the rest have all
Yeah, well,
left.
that's still a pretty good number because I would
Yeah,
imagine it would be really easy to,
yeah,
get antsy and want to go back into the real world.
absolutely. And unbelievably, even though it was 2006, I'm still friends with two or three people I met on that retreat. And I'm
Wow.
still in contact all these years later. So I made some very lovely friends from doing that.
So, and going back into the real world, then after those 10 days, when you walked out going back
Mm.
into society, what was
Yes.
that like? Was it overwhelming, or did you feel that you had the tools to be able to, as you said, like not pay attention to the chaos and still remain calm and
Oh, yeah.
centered? And you used
Yeah.
the word, I think twice already, or the phrase, maybe even three times since we began recording, inner wisdom.
Mm. That's it. I felt like this is hard to explain in words. Like the world outside was still whirring at the same speed,
Mm-hmm.
but on the inside, everything had really slowed down. And
Mm.
so I could stand back a little bit from the outside world and just process it in a
Mm-hmm.
much more observation way than being caught up in the drama of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's about the best I could explain it. It was like a surreal feeling, like you see a movie sometimes
Mm-hmm.
and someone's in a bit of a trance or a dream and they're walking through a room
Mm-hmm.
and no one seems real to them.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of a bit like that. It was like a bit of a trancey, dreamy feeling for quite a few days afterwards. And I just noticed myself paying much more attention. I was fully present for the first time in my life, because being present means, to me, my definition is when your mind and your body are in the same place at the same time
Mm-hmm.
and your awareness is directed and focused on what's happening right there and then, and you're not diverting any of your attention to the past or the future or other events. So your thinking is not divorced from your body and your presence. And so I felt for the first time, or probably in my life, I felt fully present all of the time, or most of the time I was awake. And this
So
was a new experience and it was beautiful. It was lovely.
So you just hit on another one of my favorite subjects, and
Yeah,
that is awareness.
yeah,
Because it seems like a lot of people just almost sleepwalk their way
yeah.
through life. Or even
It's
when I watch,
inevitable.
yeah,
Yeah,
well,
it's
and when I
inevitable.
watch people in public, especially, as a martial artist, it really disheartens me when I see women walking around not paying
Yeah,
attention to their surroundings, or even, when their children are around them. It's like you're missing out, number one, on so much, but number
yeah,
two, it's not safe.
yeah, yeah. I have a lot of empathy for people around this now. I've understood the whole way it works because we have a heavy load of processing to do as human beings, especially in
Mhm.
the modern world. There's so much information coming in. So many people need our attention and inputs. So we have an autopilot, and the autopilot has habits and routines that we just accept as being the best ones we got.
Mhm.
And so we're doing most of our life in autopilot. We're not stopping to consider, hey, the way I do this, is there a better way of doing it? Do I need to do it? Is there someone else that could? We never stop and reflect on the way we're doing something. Is my thinking the best kind of thinking for this now?
Mhm.
Or should I replace it with a better way of thinking? We just don't have even the time or the capacity. It's the same across the board. And
Mhm.
so I have a lot of sympathy for people in general around this. But I had a chance to break and stop and reflect. How am I thinking and seeing life?
Mhm.
And can I change it? And I found that it really served me to do that because I became much more able to respond to each moment
Mhm.
in a completely unique way than be on autopilot.
Mhm.
And so in two different moments, I might make two quite different responses, but in autopilot, I
Mhm.
just do the same thing every time. And I had that, it felt like a gift
Mhm.
that I had, but I had the space to be able to experiment with
Mhm.
it. So,
So,
um,
what would you suggest for the listeners who would, who don't have the luxury of going into, the
yeah,
monastery for 10 days and doing this retreat?
you don't need to. Yeah, you don't
Is,
need to do that.
yeah. Well, how would you advise them to
It's a
start
good
this
question.
journey of inner wisdom, consciousness, awareness, and to do it in a way that is manageable for people who do have busy lives and are
Yeah.
easily distracted by the outside world and the chaos?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a writer called Jack Pransky. And this book I'm reading at the moment again, a second time. It's called Someone Should Have Told Us. Somebody
Ooh,
should have
that's
told us.
good.
It's a brilliant book, and I highly recommend it because he makes reference to the two voices that live in our heads, the habit voice and the wisdom voice. The habit voice is the voice of the autopilot. The wisdom voice is a much quieter but way more intelligent and more powerful voice that we don't hear so often. But
Mhm.
it's one that speaks to us when we're in certain situations where our intuition is saying you're in danger here, you need to move or get out, and it doesn't make
Mhm.
any logical sense, but you need to get out.
Mhm.
And so there's a great coach called Michael Neal who wrote a book called The Inside Out Revolution. The metaphor he uses, he says, when you're doing a lot of thinking and your mind's busy, which is autopilot, it's like those little snow globes that you buy when you go on holiday and you get a souvenir and you shake it up and all the snowflakes are whirring around so you can't see what's inside the snow globe. But when you put it down on a surface and leave it, just let it all settle, the clarity and the image emerges and you see clearly for the first time there's nothing interrupting or distracting. So doing nothing and letting it settle is the thing. And as soon as you start your thinking again, it's like shaking the snow globe. So you can't solve problems by trying to think them through. It just doesn't work like that.
Boy, that
Not
is a
certain
great
types.
analogy.
Yeah. And so the key is to create stillness and quietness for your own mind. Now, how do you do that? I know lots of people who do not go to monasteries. They do things like they go swimming or they walk in the woods or they sit quietly in a chair and look out of the window or they
Mhm.
um, knit something or make a ceramic mosaic or
Mhm.
just anything that gets them out of their thinking mind long enough to create some quietness. It's what's known as an absorption state in Buddhist teaching.
Mhm.
And so I would encourage any practices like
Mhm.
that are meditative and they recharge your batteries and you don't need to be having your thinking mind in action at all. but not watching TV, because watching TV is not a meditative practice. It's stimulating your thinking constantly.
Mhm.
It feels like it's relaxing, but it's actually the opposite.
Even if you're not paying attention to the TV,
Yes.
if the television is on, your nervous system is always paying attention. Your brain is always paying attention and listening, and it's
Yes.
recording the information that the television is sending you,
You're right. Yeah.
whatever you're watching. So turn the TVs off for,
Yeah.
an, a significant amount of time a day, because that can really
Yeah.
mess with your head.
And you sound like you know this already, but it also it plants messages at the subconscious level, so it bypasses your rational mind,
Yep.
and you don't know what
Yep.
you're knowing. It's just going in.
Right. And because the brain does not discriminate between what is true or false,
Yeah.
it just records the message. Eventually, if you hear the same message over and over and over again, you're going to believe it, even if it goes against your inherent belief system.
Yeah,
Very
that's right.
insidious.
Yeah. It is horrible.
And I love, okay, so I'm somebody who has flunked meditation many times. I just can't do
Yes.
it.
And
But
that's okay.
yeah. And, I've had, a lot of lovely people that say, well, you're just doing it wrong and I'll teach you. And I thought, wonderful. One more thing that I'm not doing right. And another thing
Yeah.
to be guilty and feel shame about. But if I take I have a chair, just a small little chair, I put it in the middle of the yard and I just sit there when the weather's nice. And it's
Yeah.
so lovely because no
Yeah.
television, no radio. My husband's not talking to me. The dogs are with me, the sun will be shining and you can hear the birds. And all it just takes a few minutes and all of a sudden, I'm just so calm and it feels
Yeah.
so
Beautiful.
relaxing. And it's the same thing. I'm a knitter. But
That's
sometimes
a
I
great
take
knitting's a perfect example of an absorption state, because you just get
knit
lost in it. Yeah.
yeah, and there's something about the sound of the needles clicking together that is
Yeah.
so meditative and so soothing, and even just
Yes.
getting lost in, you've got the tactile sense of the feel of the yarn, and then just, the
Yeah.
visual watching something, out of chaos comes something beautiful to wear. So,
Exactly. Any creative activity where you're creating something artistic, anything like that's work. I even know people that do, Gabriel Roth's 5 rhythms, ecstatic dance. I would hate that myself. There's no way I'd want to do that. It's just not a form of meditative practice that I enjoy. But I know some people who, once they've done a 2-hour session of ecstatic dance, they are in a completely different energetic place, and
yeah.
they really calm down and they have a lot of insight, and they seem to sort of solve a lot of their problems just by being in the dance.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that I do, as a martial artist, is we do
Yes.
Kihon. I mean, we just practice our
Perfect.
patterns.
Yeah.
And at first it was like, oh God, one more thing I've got to squeeze into my day, when I first started all those years ago. But once
Yeah.
I started doing it and I would get into the practice of it, all of a sudden I would stop and do like one of those mental head smacking moments. It's
Mm,
like, oh, I just solved that problem. I wasn't even
mm.
thinking about it. And all of a sudden, the solution to a problem I might have been having, in life, with my work, whatever, just boom, I have a solution. It was amazing.
Yeah. And that's such a good illustration of the concept that you don't need to go outside somewhere, because what changes your reality is a change in your own thinking, a new
Mm-hmm.
insight, a new way of thinking about something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the shift, that when people go on holiday, they think they don't realize, but that's really why they're going. They're hoping for a change in their thinking whilst they're away, because they'll
Mm-hmm.
be more relaxed. But it's
Mm-hmm.
the change in the thinking that does the real heavy work, not the physical environment.
Okay, so let's go tie those two together, the change in
Yeah.
thinking and the physical
Yeah.
environment. When did you start running and why?
Yeah, it was a good question, because I'd been on this journey for 3 or 4 years as a tourist,
Mm-hmm.
going all around different parts of Asia. And as a tourist, you're looking at a lot of things and visiting a lot of interesting places. I went to an elephant sanctuary in Thailand where
Oh.
they were doing amazing work to rescue elephants that had stepped on landmines or had been badly treated by their owners, and they were rewilding them and giving them a home and taking care of them. I'd been to an orphanage in Nepal, in the Himalayas, where there were all these young kids who won't have even a proper education if they're not taken care of. And so, well, one particular place, I organized a picnic for about 60 kids, and I just saw the joy it brought. And so I had a few experiences like this, and I was thinking, God, I wish I could do more to help these people. What could I do? What could I do? How could I raise some money, for example, and make a donation? And as I was reflecting on that, I just happened to meet on my travels a guy called Matt Campbell who had run 6 marathons. He was about 10 years younger than me, but I said I wasn't thinking of that, but I said, no, what's it like to run a marathon? Just out of curiosity, being friendly. And when he started talking about it and describing it, I noticed as I was listening, because I had this awareness and I was paying attention, I noticed my skin was tingling and my body felt energized, and I could feel myself going, oh, wow, this feels really good. Listening to his story, I wouldn't mind trying that out. So I turned to him and I said, do you think I could run a marathon? Because I'm older than you. He said, have you ever run before? I said, no, not really. He said, look, you look quite fit, because I had done a lot of trekking and walking and stuff. He said, if you stay here for 6 months where I live, which was in Chiang Mai in Thailand, I'll train you how to run a marathon, because I know why you're doing it. I know you want to do it to raise money. I'll train you how to run a marathon, and I'm really happy to support you in that way. And so I shook his hand and said, okay, it's a deal. And I decided to stay there. But 7 months later, I ran the New York Marathon on the 1st of January 2009, and I managed to raise through my business network and previous connections from my life. I managed to raise about $15,000 for those things that I mentioned. And so I had then this pot of money that I went back after the marathon to those places and actually worked with the guys who are running them to actually get the money deployed well, without any leakage, without any being siphoned off for admin and other things. I wanted every single penny that was raised to be fully used in the projects. And so because I was able to get that done. I never, it sounds really like I knew what I was doing. Honestly, I was making it up. So I'd never done anything like that in my life. So I really was relying on common sense as a businessman.
Well,
So,
obviously you knew something, because you knew
yeah,
enough to know that if you just let the money go, a lot of it would be siphoned off for
yeah,
somebody's new office chair or,
yeah,
whatever.
or something. Yeah,
Yes.
I'd seen horror stories on the internet about leakage like that. So
Yeah, which is why
yeah,
when I donate, I always donate something, tangible, like, dog
yeah,
food or blankets or whatever, but
yeah,
not money,
exactly,
because I don't know where it's going or who gets it. But
exactly.
2 questions. Okay,
Yeah,
what was it like, number 1, to
yep.
run your first marathon? And number 2, what was it like to go from, living in Asia and in the area that you were, to go all of a sudden from there to New York City?
Yeah, that wasn't such a shock, because I'd obviously been to New York a few times in my life
Okay.
as a businessman. It's a common place to go, and so I knew the city. Um, and I'd made a visit on one of my trips a couple of years before that, and watched the end of the New York Marathon in Central Park with a friend who lives there.
Mhm.
And she actually said to me, and this was in 2007, she said, do you think you'd ever do a marathon, Ray? And I said, no, no way. I said, but if I did, I'd certainly think this was the best one to do. It's the biggest one in the world. And then, of course, when I met Matt, I remembered that I'd said that. And he
Mhm.
said, what marathon would you like to do? And I said, I'd like to do the New York Marathon. But honestly, I don't think I'll get a place, because it's by ballot and it's very
Mhm.
popular.
Mhm.
He said, well, why don't you just stick your name in the ballot, see what happens? I went, okay, I'll do that. And I did. And I got a place first time. And so it gave me what I would call a confirmation signal. And I talk about
Mhm.
this a lot in the book,
Mhm.
because often in life, I think people all face these decisions and we're thinking, am I making the right decision here? Am I
Mhm.
doing the right thing? Is this meant to be?
Mhm.
And you go, please, universe, give me a confirmation signal. Should give me a sign I'm doing the right thing. And so when I got an immediate yes from the ballot, and I was told I had a place, I knew I was meant to be doing that.
Mhm. So I'm guessing that's when the real fun began, because then you were
Yeah.
really training.
Yes, I was already in training by then. I
Mhm.
started my training in April and the race is in November.
Mhm.
And I knew I'd run marathons 26 miles, but I knew in my training I'd run probably about 800 miles in total over the period. And I knew that because it was also explained to me. That's why the training part of the marathon is the big job, not the actual race itself. That's relatively easy if you've done the training, to be honest.
Okay. So are you still doing marathons?
I haven't done one for a while, but I still run.
Okay.
But I did 5 marathons in total in that journey.
Wow. Well, that's
Yeah.
very impressive.
Yeah, thank you. But I may do another one. I'm a bit older now, but I'm
Well,
still
aren't we
running,
all?
still training. Yeah,
Yeah. But you're still running and you're still training.
yeah. And to answer your question, you said what was it like? It was hard work. Even though I was trained and ready, I had a little bit of an injury a month before the New York Marathon, and so I was still recovering from that. So I wasn't at
Mhm,
full fitness, but and
mhm,
my and I had a dream to run the marathon in under 4 hours because that's considered to be for amateurs. That's considered to be the holy grail if you can do a marathon under 4 hours. And I gave myself that challenge. I ran it in 4 hours and 16 minutes, so I was not far off. But I
mhm.
thought I'm not satisfied. I want to do another one and do it in under 4 hours. But it wasn't until about 6 years later, on my fourth attempt in Warsaw in Poland, that I did the sub 4 hours.
Wow. So I have to ask this. After the marathon, did you eat everything in sight?
Yeah, everything, and drank a glass of because I was off alcohol completely as well. So
Mhm.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
awesome. Okay, so
yeah.
then when did the idea come to write the book?
That came in about 2010. I'd been on the road for 5 years. And every time I met a traveler, which was often because when you're traveling, you stay in hostels and places where other travelers are, they say, "What? How long have you been traveling then?" And I'd say, "Oh, 3 or 4 years." And they go, 3 or 4 years? How come? How come? What's happened? How can you do that? And I tell them the story about the business in London and my divorce and all those mentioned earlier. And I'd say one or two of these unforeseen events that had happened because I was in a play in Australia and it happened quite randomly.
Mhm,
And they'd say at the end of an hour's conversation when we had to leave, a lot of them would say to me things like, "Do you know what, Ray? It's really fascinating. Are you ever going to write a book about any of this? Because if you do, I'd really like to read it. Can I give you my email address in case you do?" And I just laughed and said, "No way, no chance. I didn't do any of this to write it. I'm just doing this for myself so I can make sense of my own life." They said, "Well, look, if you change your mind, here's my email address just in case." And so I'd collected about 50 email addresses in the 4 years from people that I'd had conversations like this with. And they kept coming every couple of weeks. Another person would say, and eventually the penny dropped. I went, "Oh my God, the universe wants me to write a book because it's not stopping. There's more and more people asking." And so it suddenly dawned on me 2010, right, I need to think about how I'm going to write this book.
mhm,
I didn't know, I never written a book. I've written a blog, but that's 1 or 2 pages, but a book is a different thing. So I thought I need a confirmation signal that this is the right thing.
mhm,
I was in Chiang Mai and I saw a lady from New York, a literary agent and published author, was coming to Chiang Mai to do a 5-day writers workshop for new authors. I thought, oh, that's great. I happened to notice it at the time I was thinking about it. And it was the course that she was going to run was costing $1,200. And it was way, way above my station in life. I couldn't afford that. I was on a
mhm,
modest budget, and most of the work I was doing was for charity, and I wasn't earning any money.
mhm,
So I wrote to her and I said, "Look, I know I'm being called by the universe to write a book. I have no skill. You'd be a great teacher for me, of course." I said, "And if I come on your course, there's 2 things I would need to ask you to get agreed with you, which is one is it looks like it's for people who've got writing experience and I don't have any. So I don't want to be the person holding everyone else up. Would I fit in with the group and would that be all right?" And the second thing is I can't pay the full amount, but I could pay $500.
mhm,
Would that be acceptable? And she wrote back saying yes and yes. And
mhm.
so that was my confirmation signal that I was meant to be on that course.
I love your phrase, the penny dropped. I've never
Yeah.
heard that before.
Yeah, and so that's then I did the course for 5 days. That gave me the clarity, which was I knew from that I wanted to write a memoir, not a
Mhm,
fiction or a novel, or
mhm, mhm,
for me it had to be a memoir based on my own lived experience and the
mhm,
story of the journey I was in.
mhm,
So that became crystal clear. I didn't know what it would be called or what I'd
mhm,
write.
mhm,
And then about 3 years later, in 2014, I had the space and the time because by then I was spending my summers in Warsaw in Poland because I'd met a woman who became my partner and she lived in Warsaw. And so I'd spend the summers there and I had very little else to do. I started writing then. And so it took me 7 years to write the book.
So the book is it a combination then of memoir and self-help?
Yeah, combination, because I wanted to tell my story. But
Of
when I
course.
found something in that journey that helped me in my understanding with my learning, I've shared the thing I found, like
Hmm.
the book by William Bridges and Transitions, and I've included those excerpts and those pieces of wisdom from other people in the book. Another
Hmm.
example was when I had to collapse my house in London and get rid of everything.
Hmm.
I read books about minimalism by
Hmm.
Joshua Fields Milburn
Hmm.
and Ryan Nicodemus and
Hmm.
shared what they had said about it. I read a
Hmm.
book called Stuffocation by James Wallman, and
Oh, I love that
he
title.
talked about the trend in the millennials and Gen Zs that was different from my generation, which was brought up on values of materialism and being
Hmm.
materially comfortable,
Hmm.
to values for the younger generations of experientialism. In other words, young people value experiences more than they value owning stuff. And this
Hmm.
was a trend that had set in. And I was seeing that trend because I was minimalizing and getting rid of material stuff to create space for experiences in my own life. And I could see what I was doing was part of that trend.
Hmm.
And so I shared anything I found in the research field or in the teaching field. I put all those things in the book. And so there's lots of references to really good learning stuff in the book as well. Yeah.
And you do have like 6 key points that you focus
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. My editors asked me at the end of the manuscript when they read it and they were happy with it, they said, could I really draw out and highlight what were the 6 or 7 key learning points from that journey? So I did that. I sat for quite a long time and reflected on that and ended up with what I called my 6 rules for happiness. But I must stress to your audience that they're my 6 rules. They're not
Hmm.
universally applicable to anyone. But I thought
Hmm.
if I say what mine were and why I chose those, if anyone reads those, they'll just make the modifications for their own and they'll will at
Exactly.
least help them come to their own rules. But I think some of them are universally true for
Hmm.
most people.
Well, and I think it's just a good blueprint,
Yeah,
something where they can start from rather than
yeah,
just cold, just sitting there going, my mind is blank. I can't think of
exactly.
anything. So at least it's a little bit
Exactly.
almost more like little prompts to get them thinking
Yeah.
for themselves.
Yeah, great. Exactly.
And then when did you decide to just launch your own like coaching program? It looks like you've got a very extensive program.
Yeah. Well, the book launch was really the beginning of my work around life without a tie. But I've been working as an executive coach and leadership coach for the last, while I was traveling even. And the business I owned was in that field. So
Mhm.
I've always been involved in the world of
Mhm.
coaching business leaders. That wasn't new. I've just
Mhm.
evolved it and kind of changed how I'm doing that because the version of me that did it when I was a businessman in London was not the wiser and in more deeper understanding of myself version that I am today. So I could bring a lot more compassion, I feel, and a lot more kindness to the coaching work than I did in my early days, where I was much more harsh and hard and driven for results with people.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, where can people find you, Ray? How can they get a hold of you? And if they want
Yeah,
to get
lots
your
of ones.
book, where can they find your book?
Yeah. Well, the book and everything related to that, because I've got a website called lifewithoutatie.com.
Mhm.
So that's easy to find. And when the book came out, lots of people who were reading it were writing to me saying, can we see some pictures from this journey? Can we see some photos of all the different stories you've told? And so I went back to lifewithoutatie.com and uploaded quite a lot of my personal photographs from the journey.
Nice.
So if people go to that site, they'll see pictures of all these different places.
Mhm.
So that, and my work as a coach, I have a website, thedailyexplorer.com.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's thedailyexplorer.com.
Mhm.
And I'm also on LinkedIn. And a lot of people these days are on LinkedIn. And I've got a profile on LinkedIn too.
I love LinkedIn. LinkedIn has been the
Yeah.
bomb for me. I've been on it
Yeah.
since I think 2008. I can't remember, but it's been really, really helpful. And I
Yeah.
have to tell you, because I have a little bit of author envy here,
Right.
is do you realize how few people already have a list of people who want to read their book before they even write the thing?
How? No, I don't know how. Probably
Okay,
not
that
that
is
many.
so unusual that you already
Yeah.
had like all of these contacts and all of these,
Yes,
potential book sales, and you hadn't even written it yet.
that's right. I mean, it wasn't that many. I mean, and the economics of book publishing are not that great, are they? When you're an author,
Right.
um, certainly not something you do for to be making money. It never was for me. It was always for me about sharing the story, encouraging and motivating people who want to find their own true path to go for it and actually
Mhm.
start moving in that direction. Because
Mhm.
when you hear a story from someone who said, "Look, I did it and it was tricky, but it's kind of worked out," have a
Mhm.
go.
Yeah.
It's kind of the message you need, I think, sometimes.
Mhm. So you have given us a lot to think about.
Right.
So, what do you have any final pearls of wisdom that you'd like to share with the listeners? Something they can kind of mull over in their heads for a while, but not perseverate about?
Yeah. I mean, the thing I would just state over and over is, you know, really it's most important, I feel, for everyone to find their life that's true for them and really let go of any expectations that others have. And, however you want to author your life, it's okay. It doesn't need to look or feel or sound like anyone else's, as long as it's true for you.
And you can even live your life without a tie.
Yeah, you can. And no one wears ties anymore, so it's a bit redundant.
That's true.
But when I left in 2005, ties were still in.
Oh my goodness. It's amazing that that so much time has passed, right?
Yeah, yeah, right. It's 20 years nearly. Yeah,
Wow. Well, Ray, thank you so much for being here. I really
yeah, my
appreciate it.
pleasure.
I loved our conversation and great information, wonderful things for us to think about.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful, Cheryl. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you so much for listening. And boy, there are so many pearls of wisdom in this episode. Please make sure you share it with everyone you know, especially if somebody is struggling and trying to find their path to authenticity and maybe get a little bit less stress in their lives. Do reach out to Ray, check out his book, check out his websites. Wonderful guy, obviously. And if you would like to work with him, contact him. And just remember that it's your life and you need to live it the way you want without anybody telling you what to do and how to live it. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.